The hobo culture that began in the 1930s left a long-lasting impact on America, as seen today. Even though their appearance, terminology, and legal caused society to develop a negative attitude and perception towards them, their lifestyle and means for survival pushed Congress to pass laws to help them. The 1929 stock market crash was not the only event that led America to an economic depression. The Dust Bowl was another factor. It was the product of decades of mismanaged farming techniques that created a drought that dehydrated the topsoil. Eventually, the Southwest and Midwest eroded into massive dust storms that ruined the farming land even further. This caused many farming families to relocate, and many of them found themselves to be unemployed. Job loss put millions of Americans out of work and onto the streets. A hobo is one who wanders from place to place without a permanent home or means of livelihood, and are often referred to as tramps, vagrants, and migrant workers. However, unlike bums who never worked and tramps who were forced to work, hobos were itinerant workers, but they often had to beg for food at local farmhouses since they didn't have a permanent source of income.
Hobos would roam around and perform odd jobs in many city-states for food and a few coins. Some would steal as a result of desperation and inability to earn for food. Since many hobos were on the search for food and jobs, their only means of transportation were the rails. The railroads were an important feature for the penniless hobos who had nowhere else to go because it was their main way of finding jobs. Since hobos had little to no money, they would illegally hop on and off of trains, resulting in the deaths and injuries of thousands in the process. In 1932, the Interstate Commerce Commission reported that 1,886 trespassers were killed by trains and 2,791 injured. On the railroads, there were bulls who were private policemen hired by the railroad to get rid of stowaway hobos. In hopes of going undetected, they often hopped into different compartments of trains. The most comfortable place to hide was a luggage compartment or boxcar. The battery box underneath the passenger coach was uncomfortable but safe from detection. Hobos regarded the freight train services as their main means of transportation, which in turn constituted for their survival. But as they traveled from one location to the next in search of jobs, they ended up forming a community along the way. Examples of hobo communities were the hobo jungles. The hobo jungles were located close to the railroads in tall grasses and weeds, which in turn became easy means of accessibility for hobos. The jungles were places where hobos could gather to eat and sleep together. The only source of water that the hobos could access were the small waterways or fire plugs near their communities. Hooversvilles were places that many homeless people lived at, but it had no electricity or running water. Hoovervilles were named after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the Depression. There were many other things named after Hoover, like Hoover blankets, Hoover wagons, and Hoover hogs.
While they had communities of their own, they developed their own secret language which involved things like the hobo code, also known as hoboglyphs. Since many hobos were illiterate and unwelcome, they created easy markings for other hobos to read, while also making it look random for others to ignore. It had certain elements such as circles and arrows that made up their directional symbols, and hash marks or cross lines usually meant for danger in some form. The Hobo Code was known to the Brotherhood of the Freight Train Riders and used by all to keep the community of traveling workers safe, fed, and in work. Hobos use these symbols to help direct other hobos to food, water, and even away from dangerous situations. They warned each other of authorities and places that they were unwelcome in. Symbols told them if cops were inactive or active, if a town allowed alcohol or not, and if there was good water or bad water in that area. As hobo culture developed, the hobo population increased with teenagers and kids. Nearly 250,000 wanderers were under the age of 21, and an entire generation of adolescents spent time away from their families and homes. These kids learned how to survive on their own by stealing and begging for food. Young hobos that traveled alone were easy targets for criminals because they would help them commit crimes, while others traveled in groups to keep each other company and for their own protection as well. Approximately 3 million kids between the ages of 7 and 17 left school, and at least 200,000 of them took to the roads and the rails. Some of these kids left schools in order to financially support their families, while others tried to escape the life of poverty from their families and abusive treatment. Young hobos were often known as young wanderers and nomads of the Depression. They favored drugs instead of alcohol, while older hobos preferred the taste of alcohol instead of drugs. As more and more people became hobos, the hobo cultures were looked down upon by American society. It was common to hear one say no one respected a bum at that time. Most hobos were either ignored or mistreated.
They were known as people with no fixed address and dealt with mixed emotions from society, being admired, scorned, respected, ridiculed, aided, and ignored. The amount of mixed emotions toward hobos were brought on by the misguided choices that they made, such as drug and alcohol abuse. The older homeless stuck closely to alcohol abuse, whereas the younger generation of hobos favored illegal drugs such as cocaine and marijuana. In order to acquire these substances, many turned to prostitution in order to pay their drives, but homosexual prostitution profited and because men outnumbered women on the street. A federal emergency relief administration set up camps for homeless transcends who moved frequently from one place to another and seldom remained in one location long enough to be known. Other people who were homeless during the Depression lived in shanty towns, areas of crude housing made from scraps of wood, metal, cardboard, or whatever could be found. In order to help the homeless, the McKinley Act funded programs for emergency food and shelter, medical and mental health care, education, job training opportunities, and permanent housing for applicants who qualified for housing assistance. Hobos are defined as people that don't have enough money to face each day and don't have houses of their own. They are mostly nomadic people, traveling by hitchhiking or jumping on and off trains passing from town to town. They developed their own culture to survive during the Great Depression by creating their own secret language and communities. As they lived their lives on the rails, society looked down upon them, ignoring their existence. Often enough, homeless people died from starvation or heat exhaustion.